say you're asking me two technical, quote-unquote, questions, specifically the law of octaves, and you're referencing Wilhelm Nyland's group and how he speaks of two triads, do, re, mi, sol, la, si, different than Gurdjieff and Uspensky. And then you ask about the higher emotional center, the intellectual part of centers, making the assumption that the moving, emotional, intellectual aspects of mechanical human beings are separate from these higher centers which work independently. You say thus the higher parts are different organizations in a human and actually fully developed, and ordinary man, woman cannot receive their information unless higher substances produced as a result of inner work are generated to connect with them. So what we have here is the complications of that first generation of students, Orage, Wilhelm Nyland, Jean de Salzmann, Lord Pendlin, and others who tried to carry on the work, much of it from either an intellectual point of view or the dance movements, but rarely with the kind of focus on practical inner work as we find with Maurice Nicole. And what you're asking here, the confusion that you're finding in your in-depth studies, is that this particular first-generation student, Nyland, who is only qualified because he was there, which doesn't really mean anything unless we are in an apostolic succession hierarchy, complicating on his own the musical octave, the Pythagorean concept of the music of the spheres, the gifts of Gurdjieff's teachings to us on intervals and the flow of energy. Just as J.G. Bennett, another first-generation student, went towards Subud and Eastern thinking, creating communities and taking off in a direction that had nothing to do with Gurdjieff's original intent, which was simply awakening, transformation of consciousness. So, my suggestion to you, first of all, is to keep it simple. To stay away from Uspensky's error, which was to turn everything into diagrams. His separation, his dramatic turning away from Gurdjieff had to do with that very thing. Not activating the emotional center, keeping it in the head, to the point that, as you may know, he rejected the system at the end of his life. What we must remember is the fundamental idea that we have to verify everything for ourselves. So apply it to yourself then. We all know that the do of an octave needs to be struck in a particular way to have the energy to go forward. But if it's overly enthusiastic, it will burn itself out too quickly by the mi-fa interval. To throw in new sets of diagrams, new triads, new connections between the notes is absurd. So let us be honest, as Gurdjieff calls us to be, and call a worm, regardless of the position of individuals in the supposed hierarchy, which is actually non-existent. Fritz Peters, the one who was a 12-year-old boy at the Prieuré and became like a son to Gurdjieff, in his wonderful anecdotal writings, Gurdjieff Remembered, Boyhood with Gurdjieff, makes that specific point, his observation that these first-generation students who were left to carry on their own, willy-nilly, were cold, distant, had none of that vitality and joy and humor that Gurdjieff had. So let us focus on that which works in our reality, not in our head, in our being, in our becoming. So I say to you, put aside this complication that goes nowhere from the Nylon group, just as one must put aside the rigidities that are passed down by the official schools, when in fact they have crystallized something that by definition leaves out the holistic purpose of the evolution of this work for each one in this time. Now, your other question has to do with my reference to the intellectual part of the emotional center. As you may know, perhaps you do not, this is rare oral teaching. The centers can be seen in the deck of cards. So the King of Hearts is the intellectual part of the emotional center. The Queen of Hearts is that famous emotional part of the emotional center, off with their heads energy, that we can feel in ourselves when we get too reactive emotionally, over the top, or knowing people who are truly centered there and live there. And the Jack of Hearts is the energy at a soccer game, or the slap-happy, superficial emotion at a party. So these levels of refinement of energy are not, as you seem to suggest, a separation of that higher part of our center inaccessible to us mechanically. The King of Hearts, the capacity to intuit, to know emotionally, is available to us both mechanically and in times of listening to beautiful music, going to art museums, in those higher moments when we are in touch with that part of ourselves that has a subtlety of refinement and perception that transcends the mental and gives us new information. What you seem to be confusing it with is the higher centers beyond that which we carry with us mechanically. In other words, something from above that has to come to us. Some developmental stage that is beyond the work on ourselves and becomes gift from above, and therefore has a chasm between our highest potential that we can reach in our efforts here and that transition to becoming receptive to something that we do not have access to right now. So the intellectual part of the emotional center, the thinking part, just as a reference, ties in with, in a triangular way, the intellectual part of the moving center and of the intellectual center. They are closer to each other, and it goes out to the jacks, so that the Jack of Clubs, the instinctive part of the instinctive center, and the instinctive part of the emotional center are more distant. The simple working person with thick hands, a baker's assistant perhaps, who does not live in an emotional life and is very sense-based, very instinctive, does not experience life in the same way as someone who needs people, needs to be around people. But at the higher points of our capacities, the architect and the composer have more in common. So our work is to rise up above that which keeps us in these lower parts, even if we are centered in them mechanically. In other words, knowing ourselves enough to consciously rise up the ladder of our potential, of what is available to us now, even before something from above comes to help us. It already has by giving us this knowledge, by the way. So what we have here is discerning how we see life, how we react to things through observing eyes, inner separation, and choosing to respond from a better place within. So that, for instance, the King of Hearts will have a more thoughtful, measured response to a dramatic situation, perhaps, than the Queen of Hearts, which will catch fire and get all upset. Or the Jack of Hearts that won't understand how to properly relate to the needs of each person, perhaps. Each of us finds this out for ourselves. We must learn to name these things within us to help us understand how mechanical we are and what liberation looks like, what objective consciousness, allowing us to remember ourselves, to be in that third state of consciousness, pulling us out of the stimulus response and allowing the beginning of choices. So again, my advice is not to go with the intellectual center's efforts to categorize and collect data where such confusions can occur, but to experience energetically within oneself these gradations, these dynamics, and to recognize that even if one is a moving-centered person who lives with awareness of muscles and need to move the body, that balance becomes necessary to engage the emotional center, the intellectual center, to live as a man, woman number 4, who is able to see beyond just the mechanical functioning that has been our identity for most of our lives. This is the first step to an initiation into another quality of consciousness where our identity is elsewhere and ego is no longer entrapping us, and essence is free, personality is reduced in power and serves us rather than our being lost in it. This is the wonder of these teachings: practical, immediate, existential, personal, verifiable, applicable. This is why Maurice Nicoll is so important to us, because we must go past the crystallization around certain ideas of Gurdjieff, ideas of what his teachings was in 1949, beyond the dance movements, which in many ways were an external form that attracted people to this work. And though it may prove useful to some, it is not the essential aspect of these teachings. Consciousness is working in the moment of our lives, is where we are identified, where we are wounded people, dysfunctional people, in the psychology that eventually leads to the spirituality of who we become, of openness to the higher, of a life that is humble and grateful and eventually loving. That is what this work is for.